This research is looking at farmer attitudes to using animal breeding to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from beef and sheep. The presentation is in 4 parts. The first considers why methane emissions are important. The second part examines different presentations of the issues around greenhouse gas emissions from sheep and cattle. The third part looks at what breeding could contribute and what farmers think about this. And finally, I link to wider considerations in beef and sheep farming. Why are methane emissions important? Well, ruminant livestock, that's sheep, cattle and goats, produce methane in the process of digesting grass. So while we tend to think of carbon dioxide as being the major greenhouse gas, methane is also important, partly because it has 23 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. Ruminant livestock are therefore important producers of greenhouse gas emissions. In the UK, it's estimated that livestock production accounts for 7% of greenhouse gas emissions. The UK government has responded to concerns around climate change by passing the Climate Change Act. This requires an 18% reduction in greenhouse gas production from 2008 levels by 2020. Agriculture will have to play a part in this reduction, so reducing methane production is something well worth consideration. The research reported here is funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council. The research is still ongoing, and this presentation is based on a preliminary analysis of 19 semi-structured interviews, mostly with farmers, but a few with associated industries such as vets and meat processors. The semi-structured questions focused around how farmers chose their replacement breeding animals, how those decisions were influenced by what the meat markets demanded, and if the farmers selling breeding stock, the market for breeding animals demands. I also asked questions about the role of environmental issues in agriculture and what farmers perceive to be the most important issues. Finally, I also asked questions about who influences the decisions about breeding animals, but I'm not able to present those data here. This is, as I said, a preliminary analysis, and there will be a more detailed analysis presented at a future date. How are the issues typically presented? Well, here are some examples taken from newspaper cuttings and other similar sorts of material. We've already seen that the methane emissions from cows are seen as a cause of concern, so there is a question about whether cows are the cause of global warming. In one instance, I've seen cattle presented as the #1 cause of global warming. That was on a greetings card purchased from a local shop in Edinburgh. Links are often made to eating less meat as being beneficial for health for those in rich countries, and so now you can both benefit your health and the environment at the same time by eating less meat. At the more extreme end, cattle are presented as producing more greenhouse gas emissions than driving cars, and at the far extreme you see headlines like "Cattle Burp Eco-Menace." So it's clear cattle are seen as a problem requiring a solution, but at least in the UK, sheep are generally forgotten about. But when I talk to farmers, their understandings of methane emissions are very different. They see methane emissions as natural, not pollution. It's what cows do and sheep do. If we want to produce food in the UK, then methane comes with the package. Ruminants have always produced methane. It's not a new problem, so why is it suddenly an issue? Have they started to produce more methane? And anyway, what's the evidence that methane is a problem? Scientists disagree with each other, so it's hard to know what's fact. There's also strong antagonism to the arguments, and a feeling that cattle and sheep make an easy scapegoat that allows people not to address issues of driving cars excessively and flying to foreign holidays. Some farmers feel beleaguered and see the concern about methane emissions as a plot by vegetarians to discredit animal production, and ask questions about why isn't there any focus on cutting down rainforests for soya production, which is more of an issue as far as they're concerned. Many farmers in the UK feel beleaguered. Here's another thing to hit the farmer with: more rules, more paperwork. All of this suggests to me that there's little acceptance by beef and sheep farmers of the issue, and for most sheep and beef farmers there's little motivation to engage creatively with reducing methane emissions. So what can be done about greenhouse gas emissions, apart from getting rid of the animals? And as I mentioned earlier, there are some positive aspects of beef and sheep farming. Can we do anything about the amount of emissions? Well, there are a number of things that have been suggested, such as changing the feed. Others have questioned whether we have the right measure, because it tends to be measured by the amount of product produced, and some question whether that's the right way of measuring. But the aspect I'm going to focus on here is the extent to which genetic changes brought about by choosing replacement animals carefully can impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Here are some data from life cycle analysis modelling undertaken by Cranfield University. Using 2007 as 100%, the figures show how genetics has impacted on total greenhouse gas emissions per tonne of product, and if this is continued, what's the future potential? These impacts on greenhouse gas emissions are simply brought about by animals growing faster, more efficiently, and so on. The data suggest a small amount of change has been brought about in sheep and beef when compared, for example, to dairy. So one of the questions is, what is the potential for greater reduction of greenhouse gas emission in beef and sheep by increasing the uptake of genetics? What do sheep and beef farmers think about using scientifically calculated breeding values? Well, they don't trust them. They believe that breeding values can be manipulated, for example by good feeding, that an animal can have a good breeding value because it has been fed concentrates, but its progeny won't perform well on grass. And they believe that because records of performance aren't supervised, people are able to cheat on them. Many of the farmers I spoke to were quite cynical about specialist knowledge. They don't trust animal breeding scientists because they've made a mess of dairy cattle resulting in infertile and lame cows because the breeding focus has been too much on milk production. Farmers value other characteristics that are not included in breeding values, such as ease of calving. For many farmers, looks are more important than figures. If an animal looks bad but has good breeding value, it won't be selected. If two animals look the same, then the breeding value can become important. Farmers use a lot of contextual information when buying replacement breeding stock. The reputation of breeder is important. Breeding for performance could have an economic as well as an environmental benefit, but for many breeding is not just about economics. They enjoy the genetics part of their work. It makes the rest of the work bearable. And finally, there's an important role that chance plays in this. It's almost like a lottery. They might, just by chance, manage to get the right genetic combination that outperforms all their competitors. Beef and sheep in the UK are produced in a range of systems. Much of the beef is produced as a byproduct from dairy cows. And as we noted earlier, there's a lot of farming in hills. Some people focus on small pedigree herds, something like 30 cows or so. And each of these, and many like them, will impact on the farmer's primary concerns. In a dairy system, getting cows pregnant is important. The calf is the icing on the cake. For hill farmers, much of their income comes from environmental schemes, so they have to make sure that they meet the requirements of those schemes. There are other system restrictions. Sheep producers are locked into a complex pyramid where female sheep are produced in the hills in order to produce meat sheep in the lowlands. It's difficult for a single farmer to go against that sort of pyramid. Payments for slaughter animals tend to emphasise conformation, so the shape of animals becomes important. Labour is limited on many farms and restricts what you can do. And as noted earlier, breeding is just one part of the package. Health and reproduction and so on are equally important. So there are a range of factors impacting on farmer decisions, not just environmental, but also cultural, economic and social.